Now over to Idaho, where a court-approved clinical psychologist has determined that Lori Vallow, the woman who is accused of murdering her two children and then burying their remains in a pet cemetery, is not competent to stand trial after being charged with first-degree murder. Okay, Phillip, this is a case which so many people have been obsessed over for so long because it's been drawn out for so long. And what to me is fascinating is Lori Vallow is now deemed incompetent to stand trial. But this is a woman who for years went on with her doomsday scenarios that when the apocalypse happened, she would come back as God. So what I'm trying to figure out is, okay, she sounded like either someone who was a con artist or someone who was delusional. And now the fact that she's been deemed incompetent, mentally incompetent to stand trial, what happens now? What do you do with this?
The interesting thing is, Anna, and you have to remember this, Idaho doesn't have an insanity defense that's recognized by statute or by law. So as of right now, essentially what happens is the case just gets put into a holding pattern, waiting ultimately for the competency to come back, if ever. But, to the extent that you are someone who thinks that after the apocalypse, you're coming back as God, I don't necessarily know to the extent that your competency ever comes back to the extent that it was ever there. But the way that generally, competency is defined when you're thinking through, is someone competent to stand trial as opposed to, are they not? It doesn't have so much to do with, do you have a mental health disorder or not, which we know this woman does. It has more to do with, do you understand the nature of the proceedings that are occurring around you? And to the extent that you understand that you are in trial, even if you think you're coming back as God in a different life, if you understand that that's the judge, if you understand that that's the prosecutor, these are witnesses that are coming in, that's really the bare bones standard by which ultimately this case moves forward, if ever. And so at this point, essentially, the state is just going to have to wait and or, to the extent that she's receiving some sort of therapy or some sort of assistance to gain enough of a competency that the court is ultimately satisfied that she knows what's going on. Now, as you noted, she may be a con artist as well. And to the extent that she is, nevertheless, the court is going to have to be satisfied that it's not just her con artist side of things that are playing things out, but that she, actually mentally understands what's going on with respect to the process. So we'll just have to see.
I think it's possible. I do not know, but my suspicion is that she's faking it. And what do you do with a situation like that? Now, that does not rule out the possibility of mental health issues here. I don't doubt that there's a lot going on here. But this is a woman who managed for an awfully long time and is accused of being in all sorts of situations where people just mysteriously died, including some of her exes, her new husband's also ex. I mean, there's just a lot of people dying mysteriously who come in contact with this woman. So there's a part of me that says, oh, give me a break. Really? Out of all of the people, out of all of the cases that we do here on True Crime Daily, and so many of them, you think, oh, they're going to try and pull the insanity defense. Or I realize this is before an insanity defense since it doesn't exist in Idaho. And so here we go. Everything's on hold because now someone has determined that she has no clue as to what's going on in the courtroom. And I have to tell you, I'm just having a hard time buying that one.
Anna, and not practicing in Idaho, I've been practicing long enough to understand sometimes the way the politics come to play within the judiciary. So let's just kind of play this all the way out, even to the extent that she is faking it. Sometimes, right, in order to protect a record, right, when we're talking about like the trial record, the trial transcript, when we're thinking about appeal later, what if ultimately the judge hadn't ordered this? Okay. What if he hadn't ordered the fact that at this juncture, she's not competent to stand trial, even if in the back of the judge's mind, the judge knows in about 4 to 6 months, the judge is going to issue an order that she is competent. But nevertheless, in a way to just protect the record, you say, hey, she's not competent. Let's get her evaluated. Once you do that subsequent round of evaluations, now you as the judge have a foundation to stand upon and say, actually, based upon this other expert, now you're good to go. I did my part as the judge in terms of like making sure that the trial process was protected. And so now ultimately we can move forward with me as the judge knowing that I'm safe, that this case isn't going to come back on appeal because some judges up in the, appellate circuit or at the Supreme Court are going to say, well, she wasn't competent at that point. So now you have to try the whole case all over again. So, sometimes like the judges play politics too. It's a dirty secret in the game of law. But to the extent that ultimately this happens, that may be a reason behind it, even if she is faking it.
Yeah. And it does make sense, the context that you're giving us, that everyone kind of in the back of their heads has been thinking, geez, is this woman like nuts? Because look at the crazy stuff she talks about and look at all the stuff that, she's, this whole doomsday stuff. So it is very possible you're kind of like addressing that elephant in the room. Everyone's been wondering, is this woman really okay? Is she delusional or is she just evil? Or so I guess this is a way of hitting it head on. Okay, let's have her evaluated. The initial response is, yeah, she's definitely not competent right now. But the licensed clinical psychologist who conducted this evaluation has recommended something called restorative treatment. It's a legal term. So perhaps you can explain this, is a legal term for therapy that's done when there's an expectation that the condition will improve in a reasonable time frame. What does that mean?
It is just a long euphemism for exactly what we're just talking about in terms of just kind of the politicization of this. It is, okay, she's not competent now, but because we see that there may be this ability to become confident, we put you through the process. It's then signed off that you went through the process and everybody's protected. Everybody's covered. And then to the extent that, again, that record ends up going up on appeal to the extent that she's convicted of any number of these crimes, right? And any, found responsible for any number of these deaths that have occurred around her, it at least puts the trial court in a position where the trial court can say, hey, I did what I had to do. To the extent that I found that she wasn't competent, she went through the restorative process, and then she was. And then the appeals court can sign off on that too. So sometimes, with these kinds of cases where you receive so much publicity and where they are quite heavy cases, that you certainly as a trial judge don't want coming back to your court on round 2, and then you have to try the whole thing over again. You just check off a lot of boxes to protect yourself so that when ultimately, if a conviction comes, which in this case, I haven't been on, this case and reviewing it as much as, a lot of other people, including I know a lot of the fans of the show. At the end of the day, it just puts the court in a position where it can just say, hey, we protected ourselves. We did what we had to do. And to the extent that a conviction appears likely and it happens, at least then it's not coming back on appeal. So, that just kind of explains some of the process just in terms of how we see it on the legal side and how sometimes politically it plays out.
This reminds me of a case a long time ago in New York, but you'll remember it. There was the head of a crime family who was being accused of all sorts of things, as you can imagine, in organized crime. And he used to stand in Little Italy in his bathrobe, with his pajamas underneath, standing on the street and pretending to be babbling. And he was trying to convince the judge that, he was senile because we didn't even use the term, Alzheimer's or anything at that time. And there was video of him all the time outside, just walking around, mumbling to himself, trying to prove to the court that he was not competent. Well, that was in New York and they didn't buy it. But I always think of this old man in his bathrobe trying to convince the world and the judge. It's like, I'm getting away with this one. No one's ever going to believe it. I'm crazy. No. And so I always think.
Yeah, I mean, it's a rare happenstance. It's a very rare happenstance, Anna, like when a court actually finds someone actually incompetent to stand trial. Here in New York, we actually call it 730. So that's what that particular crime family associate was trying to get. Criminal procedure law, section 730. Even a lot of just the normal criminal defendants know that particular provision. And it's just like, oh, let me try to see if I can get 730'd, or, he got 730'd, in that he or she is just not competent to stand trial. So you had a little gamesmanship there that the judge clearly in New York didn't buy. But that, here in Idaho, the judge is just saying, whatever, let me just sign off on it this one time. She's going to come back restored. And then we're moving forward with this case.
Okay, so we're just going to go over some of the case for those who may not be familiar. I know most of you could do this podcast. We could get out of our seats. Y'all could sit down and tell this case so much better than us. But we also want to go over the charges that she and her husband are facing. So on May 25th, prosecutors announced first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder charges against Lori Vallow, who's 47 years old, and her latest husband, Chad Daybell, for the deaths of Lori Vallow's two children, Tylee Ryan, who was 16, and Joshua, who was referred to as JJ, who was 7 years old. So that is what they are facing. But there's even more, because when you look at Chad and you look at Lori, each of them has at least one spouse who has died mysteriously, before these two got together. So now there are investigations into those mysterious deaths that were apparently overlooked. And I always find this interesting. If you just look at one thing independent of others, sometimes it just seems like, oh, the person died in their sleep. But then when you step back and you start putting the pieces of the puzzle together and you start thinking, is there a black cloud over these two? Does calamity follow them wherever they go, and everyone that crosses their path ends up dead? Again, I do not believe in coincidence when it comes to murder. So, okay, just putting it out there. So according to NBC affiliate 12 News, the ruling came down of the charges against them on the same day that police in Chandler, Arizona, I know this is when we start to get very confusing here, announced that it would be submitting a conspiracy to commit first-degree murder against Lori in the death of her fourth husband, Charles Vallow. Okay, so we've got another case outside of Idaho that she's now going to be facing. For those of you who don't know, Lori Vallow really went on and on about her doomsday scenarios. It was a big thing. The man she ends up marrying, Chad Daybell, wrote books about it, the apocalypse. Some of it was loosely based on some Mormon theories. And so Chad Daybell, who is also charged and sitting in prison, but he's so far deemed competent, even though he wrote crazy books. His wife mysteriously dies in her sleep. Very sad. I mean, really sad, because what ends up happening is the minute that poor woman, Tammy, is dead, he marries this woman, Lori Vallow. And then that's when even more horrible things allegedly happen. So, can you just imagine? All right, so there's that going on. And then, of course, there are the two children. So the children were last seen in September of 2019. That's how long this case has been going on for, this investigation. They don't show up where they're supposed to at school. The family gets very concerned. Finally, the family manages to convince authorities to do welfare checks. Ultimately, Lori and new husband, Chad Daybell, go to Hawaii. And they're in Hawaii, but the kids are not with them. So the authorities show up there, do a knock, say, where are the children? And she's like, oh, they're wherever. But she has an answer for it, but they're clearly not in the house. They're given something like 1 month to produce the children. Now, I would think by this time, this has gone on for way too long. I mean, I honestly feel that the delay in trying to get to the bottom of what happened to those kids was a disservice to the victims, to the children in this case. Then the two of them, right? So it's the knock, where are the kids? You got to show them by the end of the month. Then the two of them disappear again, right? They're on the run, they're gone, and still no kids. She was charged, though, with desertion and with non-support of the children, but nothing else early on. So that's how they, were starting to chase these two. In June of 2020, okay, now this has gone on for a year. Chad is taken into custody after the remains of Lori Vallow's children are found buried on his property. Horrible, just horrible. And that's, when the couple was charged. Now, additionally, the couple is now charged with conspiracy to commit murder in the death of Chad Daybell's wife, Tammy, the one who died in her home. She died back in October of 2019. Okay. I mean, and I know I'm like jumping all over the place, but this is like one of those cases where you literally have the mysterious deaths of former spouses in various states, besides the two children who are confirmed dead. So Tammy's death, this is Chad's. Does this sound like a crazy story like that the neighbor would be telling you? And then Chad's wife, right?
It sounds like a movie. I mean, I'm listening like with I'm sitting on the edge of my seat and I know what happened and still just like hearing it. It's ridiculous. Like to your point, Anna, coincidence at a certain point just doesn't have a place in a certain set of facts. And here, coincidence, it's tough company if it wants to hang around and in any way try to play a part in explaining what ultimately happened. But I let you take it from here.
My goodness. Again, the injustice to all the victims that we know of, and then those who we believe may have been murdered. The injustice to them and the disrespect to them, because everyone's like, oh, it's natural causes. So Tammy was originally ruled as a natural death. She died in her sleep. So her body has been exhumed in order to do an autopsy. The autopsy was completed in February of this year, and then her death was ruled a homicide. So all of this has taken so long. And I think, Phillip, is it possible because we have so many jurisdictions? Is it possible because there are multiple states, multiple police departments? I mean, frankly, who takes the lead here? It's like Idaho has to handle the children, right? And then all these other, is that the possibility?
Arizona has to handle, her
ex-husband,
husband, right, with the conspiracy count. And then, everything with respect to the kids, of course, that's tough in terms of sometimes it's tough for, jurisdictions to collaborate if it's the county next to your county, right? Like in terms of getting those pieces together in a puzzle can be difficult. But when you're talking about states spread out across the nation, it makes it tough from an investigative standpoint. It makes it tough, like you're absolutely saying, from a trial standpoint in terms of who's ultimately going to try their case first, which case makes the most sense, such that trying this doesn't in any way compromise an issue in the other case, say back in Idaho, if you're trying the case in Arizona first. There's all these practical considerations that have to come in that in many respects can complicate the process of ultimately having the matter litigated. And to the extent that justice is, what we ultimately want to come out of it, it can certainly delay the matter. And for the defense, just to be very frank, it can, in some respects, give the defense more ammo, right? Even when you're fighting a case, whereas you're saying, and a coincidence is a little tough to play here, to the extent that you're the defense, even think about with respect to Tammy, you have the first finding that is ultimately, from the coroner's report saying that it was a natural cause of death. But then subsequently, and only after kind of all of these other, facts came to light via these different investigations in different jurisdictions, now her body's exhumed. And of course, now, the coroner's report notes that, the cause of death was homicide. And so just in certain respects, now you're giving the defense ultimately a lot of ammo to come in, at least with respect to that case, as involves Tammy, to say, well, maybe she wasn't murdered, right? Like the fact that all of these other facts happened around these other states with respect to Tammy in terms of the state proving that she was murdered, as opposed to the initial finding being it was natural causes, it can make things a little bit tough. And then what evidence from each state comes into each other state's trial? Because defense attorneys, of course, will always be trying to keep a lot of that stuff out, saying it's prior bad acts, it's prejudicial, it doesn't have any relation to what's going on in this jurisdiction. It can just in many respects complicate the process as much as just the facts in and of themselves are complicated.
Oh my goodness. And you mentioned Lori's former husband. This would have been the fourth husband, Charles Vallow. Now, he died in 2019. 2019 was just a bad year to be around these two. Charles was shot to death by Lori's brother. Alex Cox. And this happened in Chandler, Arizona. Alex claimed that it was self-defense. They were going through a bad divorce. In the court records, he had made it clear that he believed that Lori was incompetent, that she could not take care of the children because of all of her doomsday problems, that she was going to be reincarnated. And so he started at least to tell a narrative in the court record that there was something seriously wrong with his wife, that she led people to believe that there was going to be a second coming of Christ, and this was going to happen in July 2020. By the way, for those who are following this, it didn't happen. Lori was wrong. Okay. So what ends up happening is that police investigate that case, and they're like, oh, well, it's self-defense. I don't know why they bought this, but they bought that it was self-defense. And so that case is kind of put to the side. No. Before they even go back to that case, the brother, Lori's brother, Alex, my God, you need an org chart for this thing, died in December of an apparent blood clot in his lung. Now, isn't that convenient? I don't know. He may have died naturally. I have no idea. But boy, that's an awful lot of people. That's more people who are dying. So he was named by prosecutors as a co-conspirator in the murders of Joshua, Tylee, and Tammy Daybell. Even though he's dead, he's been named as a co-conspirator. Now, why would authorities name a deceased person as a co-conspirator in these upcoming cases? What value is there to that?
I mean, of course, he can't be posthumously convicted in any respect, but to the extent that he is a co-conspirator, okay, his acts, okay, that may have been separate and apart from Lori's, by him now being a co-conspirator, right, and there being ultimately conspiracy charges brought against him, the kind of catch-all provision that a conspiracy charge is for any prosecuting authority is that you now, Lori, can prospectively be held responsible for your brother's acts to the extent that you're co-conspirators, right?
Oh.
So to the extent that ultimately he took some action within some kind of agreement or upon some agreement that you and your brother made, he then made some overt act to carry out that agreement. You necessarily now can't run from the fact that, no, that was my brother and that was his decision making as opposed to me and like my own act. It's what ties a lot of the criminal offenses when you have a plan together. I mean, you think about it like with the mafia, right? Or with organized crime. One of the things that the federal government loves to do in terms of indicting members of these, gangs or of these, like mafia sets is to bring them all together under the indictment of there was a conspiracy to commit some type of act. Because now maybe the guy that rented the car to dispose of a body, right? That the person on the other side of the country can say, well, I didn't have anything to do with that. That was him that rented the car and he disposed of the body. But to the extent it was all part of the central plan, now everybody can be jointly held accountable. So in many respects, that's sometimes practically and logistically why a prosecuting authority will name people together within a conspiracy, because it allows them, again, nevertheless, to be able to go after Lori for maybe something that only her brother did.
Wow, that's fascinating. That's really, really fascinating, since there doesn't appear to be any dispute that it was Alex who shot him. That appears to not be in dispute. Wow, that's incredible. And then there are, of course, all these other relatives who were involved, meaning they were around the family at different parts of all of this playing out. My guess is that they're all filled with all sorts of information that authorities could use. One last question on this confusing case. So let's say Idaho brings up the issue of whether Lori is competent, but Arizona's like, you know what? That's just not working here in Arizona. we're not even touching that. We're going straight for this case. Does what happened in one state in any way, it can't be brought into another case in another state, right?
I mean, it can. We kind of touched upon this a little bit earlier, but the say Arizona, has to make a credible argument before the judge that can find some legal exception to the rules of evidence that would allow them to bring in a set of circumstances that occurred in a different state within the home state. And it's not easy to do. The prosecution would have to file a number of motions and make a number of legal arguments before the judge. And the defense will be fighting like crazy to keep all of that stuff out, to the extent that they would say it's irrelevant, it's prejudicial. Those, crimes within the other state have not been proven beyond a reasonable doubt yet. So it would be certainly prejudicial to bring them in to this case as if they are the truth. But nevertheless, it certainly can happen. If they ultimately need to kind of, in trying a case, tell a story to the jury that requires facts from another case in another jurisdiction to be brought in, there is a legal recognizable way to bring that in. It's just a big legal fight that has to be had because the rules of evidence generally are situated to keep those other facts out, but they can certainly be circumvented.
And the fact that these two are now married to each other, Chad and Lori, so they can't be forced to testify against each other, correct?
Correct. There's a marital privilege. So in regards to, any of those, intimate communications that they had, even to the extent that the intimacy, involved these, illicit acts, it's next to impossible to break that privilege. Few exceptions.
Yeah. And of all of the counts that they're all facing, there is one that is one of the, lesser counts. But I always, sometimes it's the lesser count that you get them on. Chad Daybell has been indicted and charged with insurance fraud related to an insurance policy he had on his wife, Tammy Daybell. And he was the beneficiary and he received those funds, which I think made it possible for them to go to Hawaii.
Yeah.
Bingo. All roads lead to Hawaii. Anyway,
all roads lead to Hawaii.
We will be following this case. We know you all are following this case. It's a crazy one. And I have a feeling this is going to take years. This case is going to take years. It's not going to happen anytime soon, but we'll follow it for you.
Great guess. I agree.